She was just 2 years old, playful, curious, and brimming with life. Only hours before, Lily Furneaux had been smiling, giggling, a little girl whose world should have been safe, simple, and filled with protection. But after her mother said goodbye and drove away, that light was extinguished. By the time she was returned, Lily was no longer moving, her small body silent. What happened to Lily was more than a single tragedy. It was the collapse of the very system designed to protect children like her. On the surface, it looked ordinary, a standard custody arrangement, a mother and father sharing time with their daughter after separation. But beneath that routine exchange lay decisions and oversights that would ultimately seal a baby's fate. The signs were there: bruises, withdrawal, documented reports, even photographs. Child welfare professionals raised concerns, yet the system failed to act. Again and again. Lauren's voice was ignored until there was nothing left to save. This is not just the story of what happened to Lily. It is the story of how it was allowed to happen. Why the courts overruled expert opinions. Why warnings were silenced. And why accountability was buried in the aftermath of her death. This documentary has been crafted with care, drawing on public records, trial testimony, and verified news reports, while no graphic details will be shared. Lily's case is told with the gravity it demands. Viewer discretion is advised. If this is your first time here, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe stories like Lily's must be heard, please subscribe and share, because your voice helps bring these cases into the light and ensures that silence does not win again. This is the story of Lily Furneaux. Lily Lynette. Furneaux was only 2 years old, a bright-eyed child just beginning to grasp the wonder of the world around her. She was a curious little explorer who found magic in the simplest things, singing to herself, scribbling with crayons, proudly covering the refrigerator in her mother's home with her colourful masterpieces. She was innocent, trusting, and utterly dependent on the adults around her to keep her safe. Lily was the beloved daughter of Lauren Furneaux and Jeffrey Wolfenbar. Lauren and Jeffrey had once been a happy couple, their early days together filled with hope and trust. But as time passed, differences began to surface, and the distance between them slowly grew. Eventually, they chose to part ways, closing a chapter that had been both beautiful and turbulent. Yet, even in separation, their love for Lily never wavered. She remained the sacred bond between them, the reason they continued to share responsibility and affection, each in their own way, as they raised their daughter. For Lauren, becoming a mother at just 22 defined her very existence. Every choice she made was guided by love for Lily, even as she juggled the exhausting demands of work and single motherhood, fiercely protective yet without financial or legal resources. She stood alone before a family court system she barely understood. In her heart, Lauren clung to a simple dream, a stable life where she could raise Lily in safety and love, supported by the strength of her own family. She imagined her daughter growing up free from danger, surrounded by warmth, security, and a mother's unwavering protection. The reality, however, was painfully different. In July 2008, when Lily was just 3 months old, Judge Michael Higgins of the Lear County Family Court issued a joint custody order 3 days a week with Jeffrey, 4 days with Lauren. Child welfare experts objected, warning of the risks of separating an infant from her primary caregiver for such extended periods. Lauren echoed these concerns, but her fears were brushed aside. Judge Higgins dismissed them as emotional overreactions, sealing his decision with words that would haunt her. "You had a child with this man, and now you're upset. That's unfortunate. Get used to it." Jeffrey, by contrast, filled a very different role in Lily's life. Though legally recognized as her father, his presence was inconsistent, his involvement more symbolic than real. For Lily, time with Jeffrey rarely meant time with him directly. Instead, Her care during those visits often fell to the woman he lived with his new girlfriend, later his wife, Renee Marie King. Two outsiders. Renee projected the image of stability. She was already a mother to 3 children of her own and seemed willing to extend that role to Lily. On the surface, it appeared that Lily would be cared for in a home that was structured and nurturing. But the reality beneath that veneer was far more complicated. Renee lived with unrelenting chronic pain, a burden that frayed her patience and left her easily overwhelmed. The added responsibility of looking after a toddler who was not her own, an ever-present reminder of Jeffrey's past, intensified the strain for Lily. This meant that her father's household, which should have been a place of safety, became a fragile environment balanced on tension. Behind the walls of what looked like an ordinary suburban home, pressure built quietly, almost invisibly, until it threatened to erupt in ways no one around her nor the court entrusted to protect her chose to see. The 18 months leading up to the tragedy were a slow, agonizing crescendo of warning signs that were ignored, dismissed, or tragically misinterpreted. Life for little Lily became a fractured existence, a constant transition between 2 vastly different worlds. Her time with her mother, Lauren, was a haven of stability and joy. In their small Michigan home, Lily was her true self, vibrant, healthy, and expressive. She would sing along to the radio, her toddler-speak version of the lyrics, a source of endless amusement for Lauren. She played, she laughed, and she thrived in an atmosphere of unconditional love. But then came the handovers. After every visit to her father's house, a house where she was primarily cared for by Renee King, a subtle but definite change would come over Lily. The little sunshine would dim. The bubbly, outgoing toddler would return to Lauren quiet and withdrawn. She would be less verbal, more clingy, and sometimes seemed anxious, a deep-seated worry flickering in her young eyes that a 2-year-old should never know. It was a stark contrast to the happy-go-lucky child Lauren had dropped off just days before. Lauren, a meticulous and worried mother, began to notice something more tangible than just behavioral shifts. Small, inexplicable bruises started appearing on Lily's body. A faint mark on her arm, a discolored spot on her leg. They were minor. The kind of things that could plausibly be dismissed as the everyday bumps and scrapes of a clumsy toddler. But Lauren's maternal instinct screamed that this was something else. She began a ritual of quiet documentation, taking photos of every new mark, carefully noting the dates and circumstances in a journal. Armed with her photographic evidence and a heart heavy with fear, Lauren repeatedly raised her concerns with the family court and other authorities. She presented her photos, described Lily's changed demeanor, and pleaded for someone to take her seriously. But her cries for help were lost in the bureaucratic void. The system, designed to be impartial, became an impassable wall. Her reports were often dismissed as the vengeful actions of a disgruntled ex-partner. The bruises were deemed inconclusive, lacking the concrete proof of abuse required for official intervention. When Lauren confronted Renee and Jeffrey, the explanations were always smooth and dismissive. Renee, the primary caregiver, would offer a plausible, if repetitive, "Excuse Lily is just clumsy." Or, "You know how toddlers are. They're always falling down," to Lauren. These explanations felt hollow, a flimsy cover for something she couldn't name but could feel in the pit of her stomach. But without the support of the legal system, her hands were tied. Lauren's ideal was a simple, universal dream for any parent to raise her child in a safe, loving, and stable home, surrounded by the warmth of family, free from harm. She envisioned a future for Lily filled with school plays, birthday parties, and scraped knees from learning to ride a bike, not from unexplained bruises. The reality was a waking nightmare. She was legally bound by the court's decision to share custody with a father who seemed largely indifferent and, more terrifyingly, to entrust her child's care to his new partner. Jeffrey frequently left Lily in Renee's care while he worked, abdicating his responsibility and ignoring the growing signs that something was terribly wrong. When Lauren confronted him about the bruises and changes in their daughter, Jeffrey dismissed her concerns with a shrug or a muttered excuse, kids get hurt all the time. To him, the marks on Lily's body were inconveniences to explain away, not warnings to be taken seriously. The shadow of danger grew darker with each passing month. Lauren lived in a constant state of unease, her instincts screaming what no one else seemed willing to hear. The small bruises, the sudden withdrawal, these were not the clumsy missteps of a toddler. They were signs, warnings etched on her daughter's body and spirit. One evening, her voice trembling, she confided to her mother, "I feel something is wrong, but I can't prove it. No one will believe me." Every custody exchange became a quiet torment, as Lauren buckled Lily into her car seat and drove to the meeting point. Dread pressed down on her chest. She was trapped in a cruel paradox the court demanded compliance. Yet every instinct told her she was handing her child into harm's way. Her lawyer's words haunted her without hard evidence. Fighting back could destroy her case altogether. Judge Michael Higgins had already dismissed her earlier pleas as over-the-top emotional reactions, branding her as irrational and effectively silencing her. And in that silence, danger grew. At 2 years old, Lily had no words to explain her fear, no voice to reveal her pain. The very system meant to protect her had stripped her of the only advocates she had. What others ignored as exaggerated emotion was, in truth, a mother's warning cry, left unanswered. It was steering both mother and child toward an irreversible tragedy. The morning of November 20th, 2010 dawned cold and grey, a mirror to the dread that had settled in Lauren Furneaux's heart. It was a routine Saturday handover. She drove Lily to the familiar meeting point, her hands tight on the steering wheel. As she unbuckled her daughter, she was struck by a profound sense of unease, a chilling premonition that coiled in her gut. There was no logical reason for it, nothing different about this day than any other, but the feeling was overwhelming. It was the primal, unspoken language of a mother's intuition, screaming a warning she couldn't articulate. She gave Lily one last hug, a little tighter than usual, and watched as her daughter was driven away, disappearing into a future that would last only a few more hours. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she held her daughter. Within hours, the unease in her chest would prove to be more than just a mother's fear. It was a premonition of the unthinkable. The events that followed are profoundly distressing. They are not shared for shock or sensationalism, but to honor Lily's short life, to bear witness to what she endured, and to remind us why we must never look away. Stories like Lily's demand awareness, vigilance, and action if you believe every child deserves safety, love, and protection. Please like, share, and comment Justice for Lily by raising your voice. You can help shine a light on these silent tragedies and perhaps prevent another child from suffering the same fate. At approximately 1:30 p.m., a call came into the Macomb County 911 dispatch. The voice on the other end was Renee Marie King. She sounded panicked, reporting that 2-year-old Lily Furneaux had slipped and fallen in the bathtub. It was a common enough childhood accident, the kind of call first responders receive regularly. But when paramedics arrived at the trailer home in New Haven, Michigan, the scene that greeted them felt anything but common. They found Lily's tiny, lifeless body lying on the living room floor. She was unconscious, not breathing. The air in the trailer was thick with an unnatural stillness. A silence that was utterly inconsistent with the chaotic aftermath of a typical domestic accident involving a child. There were no cries, no scattered towels, no puddles of water, just a chilling, silent tableau. The first responders knew immediately that something was wrong. Their trained eyes saw the glaring inconsistencies between Renee's story and Lily's condition. A fall in a tub simply did not align with the devastating trauma they were witnessing. They worked feverishly, their movements urgent and precise, trying to coax life back into the little girl's body. Lily was rushed to the hospital, a small, fragile figure surrounded by a flurry of medical professionals. But it was too late. The light that was Lily Furneaux had already been extinguished. At 3:27 p.m., she was officially pronounced dead. The sun had set on her world forever. As news of Lily's death reached her family, a wave of unbearable grief crashed over them. When informed, Jeffrey Wolfenbar reacted with shock, immediately defending Renee. She couldn't have hurt Lily. He insisted. His words a testament to his tragic denial, but when the devastating news was delivered to Lauren, her reaction was one of pure, soul-shattering agony. A guttural cry of despair tore from her throat as her body collapsed in grief. Through her sobs, she uttered the words that would come to define this case. I tried to warn them, but nobody listened. It was not an accusation born of hindsight. It was the raw, painful confirmation of every fear she had harbored for months. While Lauren's world fell apart, investigators began the methodical process of piecing together Lily's last hours. Detectives arriving at Renee King's trailer were immediately struck by the same thing the paramedics had noticed: the scene was wrong. The living room area where Lily was found was immaculately, unnaturally clean, as if someone had recently and thoroughly wiped it down. When they checked the bathroom, the supposed site of the accident, they found it bone dry. There were no signs of a recent bath. No splashed water, no damp towels, no slick of soap on the tub floor. Renee's story was already crumbling. What comes next is difficult to read. The autopsy findings are clinical and unsettling, but they are shared here not for shock, but to reveal the objective forensic truth of what happened to Lily. The truth was written on Lily's broken body. The medical examiner's report was unequivocal. It documented signs of severe head trauma and multiple contusions over the body. The injuries were extensive, brutal, and utterly inconsistent with a simple, accidental fall. The force required to inflict such damage was significant and deliberate. The cause of death was not an accident. It was ruled a homicide. Under initial questioning, Renee King stuck to her story. She repeated that Lily had slipped and fallen in the tub. But as detectives pressed for details, where exactly did she fall? How did she land? Why was she on the living room floor? Her narrative began to fray. She became flustered, her answers evasive and contradictory. At one point, she changed the location of the fall from the bathroom to the living room, a critical shift that only deepened the investigator's suspicion. The lie was too heavy for her to carry, and it was beginning to crack under the weight of scrutiny. In the cold, sterile environment of the interrogation room, Renee King initially presented a facade of controlled composure. She sat upright, speaking with a voice that was calm, but tinged with a rushed quality, as if by telling the story quickly enough, she could make it true. It was just an accident, she repeated. A mantra of denial. I didn't mean to hurt her. She appeared cooperative, answering questions promptly, but her narrative was a hollow shell, devoid of the specific, messy details that accompany real-life emergencies. This wasn't the behavior of a panicked caregiver. It was the performance of a guilty party trying to manage a story. Psychologically, she was in a state of self-preservation, likely not yet grasping the full gravity of her situation. Her mind focused solely on maintaining her innocence, but evidence speaks louder than words. While a search of her phone revealed no incriminating messages, the timeline did. The significant delay between the time Lily likely sustained her injuries and the 911 call pointed not to panic, but to a calculated pause, perhaps a period of indecision, or, more chillingly, an attempt to clean up. This was corroborated by what investigators found in the trash outside the trailer: a wet towel and a bottle of soap. The scene hadn't just been tidy, it had been scrubbed. The forensic evidence was the most damning. The pattern and severity of the bruises on Lily's head and body told a story of violent, repetitive force. This was not a single fall. This was an assault. As detectives calmly and systematically laid out the evidence before her, the dry bathroom, the cleaned-up living room, the damning autopsy report, Renee's composure finally shattered. The confident facade crumbled, replaced by the terrified reality of a killer caught in an undeniable web of facts. Her confident, rapid-fire answers devolved into long, unnerving silences. Her eyes, which had previously met the detectives, now darted around the room, unable to land on anything. Her body seemed to shrink, her posture coiling inward in a defensive crouch. The turning point came with a partial confession. She admitted that she had lost her temper when Lily wouldn't stop crying. In a small, broken voice, she whispered the chillingly simple motive for her rage. I just wanted her to stop crying. She still denied intending to kill the child. But the admission cracked the door open on the truth of what had happened in that trailer. The confident performer was gone, replaced by a weeping, cornered woman whose story had completely disintegrated for Lauren. Each new detail from the investigation was another stab to her already broken heart. When she learned the extent of Lily's injuries from the autopsy, her grief was compounded by a helpless rage. Her question, cried out to a world that had failed her, hangs in the air to this day. She was only 2 years old. Why didn't they protect my child? That question is not just the cry of a grieving mother. It is a challenge to us all. The warning signs, the bruises, the behavioral changes were there. They were noticed. They were reported. But they were not acted upon. Do not make the same mistake in your own life. If you see something that feels wrong, if you suspect a child is in danger, you must act. Your intervention could be the difference between life and death. The trial of Renee King was a study in stark, painful contrasts, truth versus deception, unrestrained grief versus cold-hearted denial. The prosecution methodically constructed a timeline of terror. They argued that the severe, multiple blunt force trauma injuries to Lily's head and body could not have possibly resulted from a simple fall. They were, unequivocally, the result of a deliberate and violent assault. The evidence was overwhelming the scrubbed crime scene, evidenced by the wet towel and soap discovered in the trash, the telling delay before calling 911, and Renee's own inconsistent, shifting stories, which revealed a consciousness of guilt. The prosecutor argued that Renee King hadn't just killed a child in a fit of rage, she had actively tried to conceal her crime, compounding the atrocity. The defense, faced with a mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence, attempted a strategy of mitigation. They painted Renee as a sympathetic, tragic figure, a woman overwhelmed by chronic pain and the immense stress of raising 4 children. Her actions, they argued, were not born of malice, but were the result of a momentary loss of control. They were not asking for acquittal, but for a lesser charge, a plea for understanding that rang hollow in the face of the brutality Lily had endured. The most powerful dynamic in the courtroom was the silent war waged between 2 women, the perpetrator and the victim's mother. Renee King was a specter of self-preservation. She entered the courtroom each day looking gaunt and haggard, her eyes red-rimmed, but startlingly empty. She sat with her shoulders hunched, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, creating a physical barrier against the world. When the prosecutor displayed the autopsy photos, detailing the horrific injuries inflicted upon Lily's small frame, Renee barely looked up. She steadfastly avoided the gaze of everyone, most pointedly that of Lauren Furneaux. In those rare moments when a tear would escape, it was wiped away so quickly it seemed more a reaction to stress than a sign of genuine remorse. Crucially, throughout the entire trial, she never offered an apology, never once showed a clear sign of regret for her actions. Her silence was a complex shield of fear, shame, and a chilling refusal to confront the consequences of her rage. In the gallery sat Lauren Furneaux, the living embodiment of a mother's worst nightmare. She was the polar opposite of Renee's cold detachment. Her grief was a raw, palpable force in the room. Her eyes, swollen from crying, were fixed on Renee, searching for an answer, a sign of remorse, anything that might make sense of the senseless. When the prosecutor described Lily's injuries, Lauren's body would shake with uncontrollable sobs. Her testimony was the emotional climax of the trial. Her voice, trembling but resolute, filled the courtroom as she recounted her desperate, ignored attempts to protect her daughter when she asked, she was only 2 years old, why didn't they protect my child? It was not just a question for Renee. It was an indictment of an entire system that had failed them both. Lauren faced the horror head on, her pain a beacon of truth. While Renee retreated into a fortress of silence, the jury needed little time to see the truth. After just 2 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts felony murder, child abuse, and involuntary manslaughter. Renee King was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, in its legal form, had been served. Her subsequent appeal was denied, cementing her fate. In the aftermath, Jeffrey Wolfenbar, the man who had stood by her, quietly filed for divorce. The contrast between these two women serves as a powerful, enduring lesson. Renee's silence, her excuses, her avoidance. These are the behaviors of someone hiding a terrible truth. Lauren's cries for help, her documentation of bruises, her articulation of a gut feeling that something was wrong, these were the signals that were tragically missed. Children, especially those as young as Lily, cannot speak for themselves. They rely on us, the adults in their lives, to be their voice, to see what they cannot say. Let Lily's story be a permanent reminder when a child's well-being is at stake. We must listen to the whispers before they become screams. Lily Furneaux's funeral was a sea of sorrow. Hundreds of community members, friends, and family gathered to say goodbye to the little girl whose smile had been a gift to them all. From the depths of tragedy, a memorial fund was created to support families in crisis, a small light of hope rising from unbearable loss. For Lauren, shattered though she was, grief became purpose. Lily was the light of my life, she said, her voice trembling yet resolute. I will never stop fighting to ensure no other child suffers like my daughter. True to her word. Her fight for justice ignited a movement. The hashtag Justice for Lily spread across social media, transforming into a rallying cry for reform in family courts and child welfare systems. Lily's story forced an urgent reckoning when procedure is prioritized over protection. Children pay the price. The story of Lily Furneaux is not only a tragedy, it is a warning. It reminds us that children are the most vulnerable among us, dependent on our vigilance, our voices, and our courage. We have a sacred duty to be their protectors, to listen when they cannot speak, to act when others turn away, and to never dismiss the smallest signs of danger. Let Lily's legacy be one of protection and prevention. Let her memory be the reason another child is saved. Please, share her story. A single post, a single conversation could reach someone who needs to hear it. It could save a life. Your awareness can save a life. Comment Justice for Lily to stand with her.